The factory was a relic of another era, a crumbling testament to how little the owner cared about his workers. The walls were streaked with rust and grime, the floor cracked and uneven, and the air reeked of oil and mildew. Most of the machinery was decades old, barely held together with duct tape and the prayers of the underpaid crew who ran it. The heating system didn't work, and on cold nights like this one, the chill seeped into your bones. I hated working the night shift. Alone in that cavernous, decrepit building, every sound echoed like a ghost in the walls. I was stationed in the supervisor's office, a glorified broom closet with a desk, a chair, and a tiny monitor that cycled through grainy security footage. Most of the cameras barely functioned, showing static or flickering images of empty hallways. The owner, Mr. Draper, was a greedy bastard. He'd sooner cut corners than spend a dime to fix anything. Rumour had it he'd bought the place at auction for dirt cheap and had been squeezing every last cent out of it ever since. Safety inspections were a joke, and most of the staff were too afraid of losing their jobs to speak up. That night around 2 a.m, I was doing what I always did, counting the hours until dawn. I leaned back in my creaky chair, my hands wrapped around a thermos of lukewarm coffee, staring at the flickering monitors. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of the old building settling. But then it came, an alarm, a loud, shrill, high-pitched scream that pierced the quiet like a knife. I jumped, nearly spilling my coffee as my heart slammed against my ribs. The sound was unmistakable, the kind of piercing wail you'd hear from an emergency exit alarm. It was coming from somewhere deep within the factory, echoing down the empty halls. I grabbed the flashlight from the desk and stepped out of the office, my boots crunching on loose debris scattered across the floor. The alarm blared incessantly, each pulse seeming to draw me further into the belly of the building. "Hello?" I called, my voice sounding small and uncertain against the industrial backdrop. No response. The hallway stretched on, dimly lit by a few flickering overhead lights. The walls were lined with old pipes, some dripping water that pooled on the cracked concrete. The smell of dampness and decay grew stronger as I moved closer to the sound. Finally, I turned a corner and saw it. The emergency exit door. It was slightly ajar, the source of the alarm. The red light above it blinked in time with the wailing, casting eerie shadows that seemed to crawl across the walls. I approached cautiously, my breath visible in the freezing air. Pushing the door open, I shone the flashlight outside. The parking lot was empty, the cold wind whipping past me. I half expected to see someone running away, but there was nothing, just darkness and silence. As I turned back toward the hallway, the alarm stopped. The sudden quiet was deafening. And then, a low, guttural creak, like metal straining under immense pressure. It came from above me. I barely had time to react before the roof collapsed. The noise was thunderous, steel beams snapping like twigs, concrete crumbling, and dust filling the air like a suffocating cloud. I stumbled backward, coughing and shielding my face as debris rained down. When the dust settled, my flashlight beam wavered over the wreckage. Twisted metal jutted out like skeletal fingers, shattered glass glittered among the rubble, and chunks of concrete formed a mountain of destruction. My office, the place where I'd been sitting just minutes before, was buried beneath tons of debris. I stared at the spot, my chest heaving as my breath came in shallow, panicked gasps. My chair, my desk, everything was crushed. My stomach churned as I realised there was no way I would have survived if I had stayed in that room. The cold crept in, but I barely noticed it. My mind raced, a chaotic mess of fear, confusion, and disbelief. How had this happened? Why had the alarm gone off? None of it made sense, and yet here I was, alive when I shouldn't have been. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, before I heard the distant wail of sirens. Someone must have called for help. Later, I learned it was a driver passing by on the nearby road who had seen the collapse. They'd pulled over and called the fire department. By the time the trucks arrived, their lights flashing in the darkness, I was still standing in the same spot, numb and covered in dust. A firefighter approached me, asking if I was hurt. I shook my head, unable to form the words to explain what had happened. They led me outside into the freezing air, and I sat on the curb, trembling. My hands wouldn't stop shaking, and my thoughts kept looping back to that alarm. The firefighters combed through the wreckage, ensuring no one else was inside. A few minutes later, the police arrived. They took my statement, their pens scratching on notepads as I explained how I had heard the emergency alarm, and left the office just in time. By the time they let me leave, the sun was starting to rise. I drove home in a daze, barely registering the road ahead of me. For the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the rubble, heard the alarm, felt the overwhelming weight of everything I'd almost lost. Then a week later, I got a call. The voice on the other end introduced himself as one of the officers who had been at the scene. "We just have a few follow-up questions," he said. "Sure," I replied, though the thought of reliving that night made my stomach churn. "We've been investigating the structural failure," he continued. "But we're also looking into the alarm you mentioned. You said it came from the emergency exit, right?" "Yeah," I said, frowning. It was loud, definitely an emergency alarm. I heard his hesitation, the brief pause before he spoke. "Sir," the officer said carefully, "we've reviewed the building's records. That factory doesn't have an alarm system. No emergency alarms, no safety measures, nothing." I froze, my heart stopping for a moment. "What? That's not possible. I heard it. That's why I left the office." "I understand," the officer said. "But I'm telling you, there's no alarm in that building. The owner cut corners on everything. The only reason you're alive is, well, I guess you just got lucky." I didn't know what to say. My thoughts spiraled, trying and failing to make sense of what I'd heard. If there was no alarm, if it wasn't supposed to be there, then what had I followed? The more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This wasn't some random, freak coincidence. Someone, or something, had intervened. It was as if I'd been pulled out of harm's way, guided to safety in the only way I would have listened. When I hung up the phone, my hands wouldn't stop trembling. The idea that something unseen had orchestrated that moment, had led me out of that office just seconds before disaster struck, sent chills down my spine. Even now, I can't stop replaying it in my head. The alarm, the urgency, the timing, it wasn't luck. It was deliberate. Whatever it was, I don't think it wanted to hurt me. It wanted to save me. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows each other's business, and nothing much ever changes. After finishing school, I stayed to be close to my family and picked up a job working the night shift at the local gift shop. It wasn't much, but in a town this small, you took what you could get. The shop was a cosy little place on Main Street, filled with shelves of knickknacks, postcards and handmade crafts from local artisans. It wasn't fancy, but it had charm, with soft music playing in the background and the smell of lavender sachets wafting through the air. My manager, Mr. Sullivan, was the kind of boss you'd be lucky to have. He was in his late 50s with silver hair and kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled. He treated everyone with respect and went out of his way to help, whether it was offering advice on how to handle customers or giving me a ride home on rainy nights. Working for him made the job feel safe, even if the long, lonely hours could sometimes get to me. I settled into the job quickly. The work was simple, the shop was quiet, and the customers were few, especially during the night shift. For the most part, it felt routine, even a little comforting, like I'd found my own little corner in the rhythm of the town. Still, there were moments when the quiet would stretch too long, and I'd feel a strange unease, like the shop was holding its breath. At first, I chalked it up to the loneliness of working late, but as the weeks went on, I started hearing bits of gossip from some of the daytime employees. That's when I learned about Emily Carter. She'd worked the night shift before me, and her story was the kind that everyone whispered about, but no one wanted to discuss openly. Emily had accused Mr. Sullivan of stalking her, following her home and worse, but the accusations didn't stop there. She'd even claimed that the youngest son of the Lancaster family had harmed her in ways she wouldn't elaborate on. The Lancasters practically ran the town, their wealth and influence touching everything. Most people were too afraid to cross them, and Emily's accusations were dismissed as the ramblings of a girl who'd lost her grip on reality. She was eventually sent to a psychiatric hospital, and the shop moved on like nothing had ever happened. Hearing the story unsettled me, but at the time it felt distant. like a cautionary tale, not something that would affect me. Mr. Sullivan was nothing like the man Emily had described, and the shop seemed like such a harmless place. I tried to push the whispers to the back of my mind. I didn't think much of it until I found the box. It was a quiet Tuesday night, the kind where the hours stretched endlessly. I'd finished restocking the shelves and decided to clean up the small back storage area, a part of the shop most people didn't even know existed. It was a cramped, dusty space behind a locked door that Mr. Sullivan had given me a key to. I was moving some old boxes when I noticed one shoved far into the corner, almost completely hidden under a tattered tarp. It was heavier than it looked, and when I pulled it into the light, I saw that the lid was taped shut. Curiosity prickled at me. I grabbed a box cutter and sliced through the tape, lifting the lid. Inside were papers, photographs, and a USB drive. It was clear that someone had gone to great lengths to keep this hidden. The name on the first page I picked up made my heart skip a beat. Emily Carter. I hesitated, glancing toward the door, as if someone might catch me, even though I knew I was alone. Slowly I began sifting through the contents. The papers were letters Emily had written, desperate and pleading. They described how Mr. Sullivan had followed her, harassed her, and threatened her when she tried to leave. But the worst of it was the way she described the youngest son of the Lancasters. The letters didn't go into detail, but they hinted at something far worse than harassment. Emily wrote that she had proof of what he'd done, but she didn't know where to turn. My hands shook as I read her words. She talked about being afraid, about feeling like no one in town would believe her. By the time I got to the photographs, my stomach was in knots. They showed Emily at the shop, her expression growing more frightened in each picture. Then there was the USB drive. I stared at it for what felt like forever before plugging it into my laptop. The video file was dated 2 years ago. The footage was grainy and dim, showing Emily pacing nervously in the back room, the very room I was sitting in. Then the door opened and Lancaster Son walked in. I can't describe what happened after that. I don't even want to. The contents of that video were too horrifying, too monstrous to put into words. I slammed the laptop shut, my stomach turning and tears burning in my eyes. I sat there shaking, trying to process everything. Emily had this evidence, so why hadn't she gone to the police? Then I remembered her letters. She had tried, she'd begged for help, but the Lancasters had made sure no one would listen. Instead, they'd locked her away, painting her as a delusional girl with wild fantasies. I knew I couldn't leave it alone. The next day I packed everything back into the box and drove straight to the nearest police station. I handed it over to an officer, explaining what I'd found and begging them to look into it. They promised to investigate, and for the first time I felt like maybe, just maybe, something would change. A few months later I heard the news. Emily was released from the hospital. They couldn't keep her there any longer without evidence to back up the Lancasters' claims of her instability. But nothing happened to either one of the men who ruined her life. The Lancasters' influence ran too deep, their power too absolute. The police didn't pursue charges, and the town went on as if nothing had ever happened. I quit the job soon after. I couldn't stay there, not after everything I'd seen. A few days after leaving I got a message. It was from Emily. All it said was, "Thank you. I can only hope that Emily is able to put this behind her, move forward, and live the life she deserves. A life free from the shadows of that place." I never planned on being a security guard. Honestly, I only took the job because my friend Jake wouldn't stop talking about how easy it was. "You just sit there, watch some cameras and walk around a couple of times," he'd said, laughing as he handed me the flyer for the opening. "No training needed, you'll love it." At the time, it sounded perfect. I was between jobs and the hours fit my schedule. The pay wasn't great, but I figured it'd be an easy gig. Low stress, no heavy lifting, just a quiet warehouse on the outskirts of town. What could go wrong? The answer, I learned, was a lot. The warehouse was massive, with towering shelves and endless aisles, stocked with industrial equipment and supplies. It was divided into 2 sections. The newer side, brightly lit, and monitored with high-quality cameras, and the older section, which was practically falling apart. That part of the building was dimly lit, cold, and filled with outdated equipment that hadn't been touched in years. I was issued a flashlight, a logbook, and a taser that felt more like a toy than a weapon. No gun, no real training, just a few quick pointers from the guy I was replacing. "Stick to the rounds, don't fall asleep, and you'll be fine," he'd said, grinning as he handed me the keys. The first few nights were uneventful. I walked the perimeter, checked the doors, and kept an eye on the monitors in the security office. The silence was almost soothing, and I started to think Jake had been right. This was an easy job, but everything changed on my 5th shift. I was doing my first round of the night, walking through the older section, when I noticed one of the doors to the loading dock was slightly open. That wasn't supposed to happen. The warehouse was locked up tight before every shift, and I hadn't seen anything out of place earlier. I stepped closer, shining my flashlight into the darkness beyond the door. Nothing. Just the empty loading dock and the faint sound of the wind outside. I locked the door, made a note in my logbook, and kept moving, figuring it was just a mistake. Back in the security office, I sat down to check the cameras. Most of the feeds were normal, just endless rows of shelves and equipment. But when I switched to the older section, something caught my eye. A shadow moved across the screen, disappearing behind a row of shelves. At first, I thought it might have been a trick of the light. The older cameras were grainy and prone to glitches, and shadows often looked bigger than they really were. But as I kept watching, I saw it again. This time, clearer. Someone was in the building. My stomach tightened. I grabbed my flashlight and the taser, my hands trembling as I stepped out of the office. "Security!" I called out, my voice echoing through the warehouse. "You're not supposed to be here!" No response. The older section was eerily quiet. The lights flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch and move with every step I took. My boots echoed on the concrete as I moved down the aisles, scanning the shelves with my flashlight. "Hello?" I called again. Nothing. I was about to head back to the security office when I heard it. A faint metallic clang, like something falling over. It came from deeper in the older section. My grip tightened on the taser as I followed the sound, my heart pounding in my chest. As I rounded the corner, I caught a glimpse of movement, a figure darting behind a stack of pallets. "Stop!" I shouted, raising the taser. "Come out where I can see you." They didn't. Instead, they kept moving, disappearing deeper into the warehouse. I returned to the security room, heart pounding, and locked the door and called the police. "This is the security guard at the East Industrial Warehouse," I said, my voice shaky. "I think there's an intruder in the building. They're still inside." The dispatcher assured me officers were on the way, but I knew it would take them at least 10 minutes to arrive. Until then, I was on my own. I watched the cameras, my pulse racing as I tracked the figures' movements. They were quick, moving with purpose, as if they knew exactly where they were going. At one point, they turned toward one of the cameras, and for a split second, I saw their face, covered by a mask. My blood ran cold. Suddenly, the camera feeds from the older section started cutting out, one by one, until all that was left was static. And then, a loud bang came from outside the security room. I jumped, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of footsteps followed, slow and deliberate, stopping just outside the door. "Police are on their way," I shouted, trying to sound braver than I felt. The footsteps paused, and then there was silence. When the officers arrived, they swept the building. It didn't take them long to find the intruder, or rather what they'd left behind. One of the officers found a stack of high-value industrial tools near the loading dock, ready to be taken out. It was a robbery. The intruder had been stealing from the warehouse, using the older section to avoid the newer cameras. But that wasn't all. They also found a gun, a loaded handgun, dropped near the shelves where I'd last seen the figure. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. If I'd confronted them directly, if they'd turned on me, my taser wouldn't have stood a chance. I quit the job the next day. Jake was wrong. This wasn't an easy gig. It was a gamble, and that night I'd been lucky. But luck wasn't something I was willing to bet on again. I've always dreamed of being a singer. Growing up, I used to imagine my name in lights, playing to sold-out crowds, my voice filling arenas. But dreams don't pay the bills, and in a small town like mine, opportunities to break into the music industry were few and far between. To make ends meet, I worked the closing shift at a little diner on the edge of town. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady. I spent my days recording demos and emailing them to producers, hoping for a big break, and my nights cleaning tables and locking up after the last customers left. Even when the diner was empty, I couldn't help but sing while I worked. The acoustics in the dining room were surprisingly good, and the soft hum of my voice made the quiet feel less lonely. Singing there helped me hold on to the dream, even when the grind of everyday life tried to pull me down. That night started like any other. By 10:30 the place was empty, and I locked the doors behind the last customer. The routine was second nature. Clean the tables, wipe down the counters, sweep the floors. As usual, I sang while I worked, my voice echoing softly through the empty room. But as the minutes ticked by, a strange feeling crept over me. At first, it was just a sense of unease, the kind you can't quite explain. The air felt heavier, like it was pressing down on me. I paused mid-song, glancing around the room. The tables were empty, the chairs stacked neatly, and the faint buzz of the neon sign outside cast its familiar glow. Everything looked normal. I tried to shake it off, chalking it up to being tired, and went back to cleaning. But the feeling didn't go away. As I moved toward the register, a faint metallic smell reached my nose. It was sharp, like blood or old coins, and so subtle I almost missed it. My heart gave a nervous flutter. I looked around again, my eyes scanning the shadows in the corners of the room. "Hello?" I called out, my voice cracking slightly. Silence. I told myself I was being paranoid. The doors were locked and I was alone, just like every other night. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I walked into the back office to grab my bag, ready to call it a night. The small room was just as cluttered as always, with papers piled on the desk and a lingering smell of stale coffee. But as I reached for my bag, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The desk drawer, the one I distinctly remembered closing earlier, was slightly open. My breath caught as I stared at it. I knelt down and pulled it open all the way, revealing a folded piece of paper sitting neatly on top of a stack of receipts. My name was written on the outside, in blocky, deliberate letters. My hands shook as I picked it up. I unfolded the note and my stomach churned as I read the first line. "I plan to kill you tonight." The world seemed to tilt around me. My legs felt weak and my chest tightened as I stared at the words, my mind racing. I forced myself to read the next line. "But your singing was so beautiful. I couldn't go through with it." My heart pounded, each beat echoing in my ears. Someone had been there. Someone had listened to me sing, watching me the whole time I thought I was alone. The final line was written in bold, underlined letters. "Quit this job. You won't be so lucky next time." My body went cold. I grabbed my bag, nearly knocking over the chair in my rush to leave. My hands trembled as I unlocked the front door, leaving the lights on and the registers untouched. I didn't even care if Mr. Bradley, the owner, chewed me out for it later. I just needed to get out of there. The next morning, after a sleepless night, I called Mr. Bradley. I told him about the note, how I was terrified, how someone had been in the diner while I was cleaning. He laughed. "Don't be ridiculous," he said. "It's just a prank. Someone's messing with you." I tried to argue, but he brushed me off. "You're overthinking it. Just lock the doors and keep working. You'll be fine." I quit that day. I didn't care if he believed me. I didn't care if I had to scrape by for a while. The thought of going back to that place made my skin crawl. Months passed and I tried to move on. I threw myself into my music, recording more demos and playing small gigs at local bars. Life started to feel normal again, until I heard the news. The diner had been robbed late at night. The owner had been there alone, cleaning up just like I had so many times. The intruder hadn't just taken the cash, they'd attacked him, leaving the kind of scene that makes headlines in a small town. The police called it a botched robbery, but I couldn't help but wonder, was it the same person who'd left me that note? Had they come back? I'll never know for sure, but one thing still haunts me, the warning they left. "Quit this job, you won't be so lucky next time." It wasn't just advice, it was a promise. Working the late shift at the warehouse wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. The hours were long, the fluorescent lights always seemed too bright, and the air smelled faintly of oil and cardboard. Still, I liked the quiet of the night. With fewer people around, I could put on my headphones, do my rounds, and pass the time in relative peace. Most of the team hated the night shift, but one person who never seemed to mind was Arturo. He'd been with the company for years and was the kind of guy who got along with everyone. He worked hard, cracked jokes, and always seemed to know how to lighten the mood during a tough shift. But about 2 weeks ago, Arturo stopped showing up. No one said much at first. Sometimes people just quit without notice, especially in a job like ours. But it was strange for Arturo. He wasn't the type to leave people hanging. By the second week of his absence, the whispers started. Some of the guys on the crew speculated he'd taken off to avoid trouble. Maybe he'd had legal issues or family problems. Others joked that he'd won the lottery and skipped town. But me, I didn't know what to think. I just knew it wasn't like him. That night I was assigned to clear out Arturo's locker. Management said they needed the space for a new hire and told me to handle it during my shift. I didn't think much of it. It wasn't the first time someone had vanished without cleaning out their stuff. Arturo's locker was tucked at the far end of the break room, near the door that led to the loading docks. The lockers were old and dented, their paint peeling from years of use. I grabbed the master key from the supervisor's desk and headed to the back, the sound of my boots echoing on the concrete floor. When I got to his locker, I paused. It felt different. The air around it seemed colder, heavier somehow, and for a moment I hesitated. I brushed the feeling off, chalking it up to fatigue, and unlocked the door. The locker door creaked open, revealing a few items scattered on the shelves: an old baseball cap, a pair of gloves, and a half-empty water bottle. But as I grabbed the gloves, I noticed something strange. The locker felt heavier. Not just the door itself, but the entire thing, like there was something weighing it down from inside. Frowning, I shone my flashlight into the back of the locker. That's when I saw it. A faint seam along the rear wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Not just the door itself, but the entire thing, like there was something weighing it down from inside. Frowning, I shone my flashlight into the back of the locker. That's when I saw it. A faint seam along the rear wall, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Curious, I reached out and pressed against the seam. The panel shifted slightly, revealing a hidden compartment. My stomach dropped. Inside was a small, tightly packed bag. Its surface was rough, covered in duct tape, with a pair of heavy-duty gloves lying on top. Next to the bag was a crumpled, dirty rag, stained dark red. My heart started to race. The air around me seemed to grow colder as I stared at the items, my mind racing to make sense of what I was seeing. Blood? Why would Arturo have something like this hidden in his locker? The bag looked hastily packed, as though someone had shoved everything inside without thinking. My hand trembled as I reached for it, but I stopped myself. Something about it felt wrong, like touching it would make everything worse. I closed the compartment and stepped back, my breath quick and shallow. I didn't want to be there anymore. I wanted to leave, to pretend I hadn't seen anything, but I knew I couldn't just walk away. Instead, I locked the locker and called my supervisor, telling him there was something strange and that he needed to check it out. The police were called later that night. I didn't stick around to see what they found, but I heard the rumours the next day. The officers had opened the compartment and discovered something I never expected: Arturo's body. He'd been crammed into the hidden space, his limbs twisted unnaturally to fit. The warehouse buzzed with gossip for days. Some said it was a robbery gone wrong. Others whispered darker theories. The truth didn't come out until weeks later, when the police concluded their investigation. Arturo had been in debt to coyotes, the kind who smuggle people across the border. He'd borrowed money to come to the US years ago, promising to pay it back. But he'd fallen behind on his payments, and they'd decided to make an example out of him. The hidden compartment, the bag, the blood-stained rag, it was all part of a gruesome message, a warning to anyone else who might try to cross them. I quit the warehouse not long after. The thought of walking past that locker every night, knowing what had happened there, was too much. Even now, I can't stop thinking about Arturo, how he'd always been so cheerful, so full of life, and how none of us had any idea what he was dealing with. I wish I'd known. I wish I could have helped. But the truth is, no one saw it coming. And sometimes I wonder if whoever did it is still out there, waiting for their next victim. I've worked at a small cafe for about a year now, and I've seen all kinds of people walk through our doors. It's a cosy spot in the middle of town, popular with students, remote workers, and couples on casual dates. Most days are calm, the kind of routine that feels almost comforting. That's why the night it happened still feels so surreal. I was on the evening shift, working alongside Hayley, the manager. She's one of the nicest people I've ever met, always smiling, always finding ways to make the job easier for everyone. She'd been running the cafe for years and the regulars loved her. The night was quiet, with just a few customers sipping their drinks. By 8 p.m, most had left, and Hayley was in the back office, tallying receipts while I cleaned the espresso machine. That's when the door swung open, and a man stepped inside, holding a box. He was dressed like a delivery driver, blue polo shirt, black cap, and an ID badge clipped to his chest. His face was neutral, almost too neutral, as if he were deliberately trying to avoid any emotion. "Delivery for Hayley Carter," he said, his voice flat. I frowned, wiping my hands on a towel. "Hayley's in the back. I can take it." The man shook his head, gripping the box tightly. "No, it has to be opened immediately. I need her to sign for it." Something about the way he said it made my skin crawl. His insistence felt off, and the way he held the box, it wasn't casual. It was stiff, deliberate. "Okay, hang on," I said, forcing a smile. "I'll get her." I walked to the back and knocked on the office door. "Hey, Hayley, there's a delivery for you. The guy says you need to sign for it." Hayley looked up, puzzled. "I didn't order anything." "It's a special order," he said quickly. "From someone named Jacob." Hayley froze, her face draining of colour. Jacob was her ex-boyfriend, a name she hadn't mentioned in months, but one I remembered from a conversation we'd had once after a busy shift. She'd broken things off with him after a tumultuous relationship, and he hadn't taken it well. "I don't want anything from him," Hayley said, her voice firm. "Take it back." "You have to open it," the man insisted. "Right now." The tension in the room was suffocating. I stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Look, if she doesn't want it, she doesn't have to take it. You can leave it here and we'll figure it out later." The man hesitated, his grip tightening on the box. "Fine," he said finally, setting it down on the counter. "But you need to open it now. I'll wait outside." Without another word, he turned and walked out, disappearing into the darkness. Hayley and I stared at the box, neither of us moving. It was wrapped in plain brown paper, tied with twine, and had no return address. "Don't open it," Hayley said, her voice trembling. "Something's wrong." But part of me didn't want to leave it there. If it was a prank or something harmless, I needed to know. So against my better judgment, I grabbed a pair of scissors and started cutting the twine. "Wait," Hayley said, stepping back. "Be careful." I peeled back the paper, revealing a plain cardboard box. My hands trembled as I opened the flaps, and my stomach turned when I saw what was inside. Wires. A battery. A small, crude device taped together with a timer that was already counting down. My heart stopped. "Get out!" I shouted, shoving the box to the edge of the counter. "Now!" Hayley ran toward the door, and I was right behind her when it happened. The explosion wasn't as loud as I'd expected, but the force knocked me to the ground. A wave of heat hit my arms and face, and a sharp, stinging pain shot through my hands. The smell of burnt plastic and chemicals filled the air as I scrambled to my feet, coughing. Hayley was outside, unharmed, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. "Are you okay?" she screamed, running toward me. I looked down at my arms where the skin was red and blistering in spots. My hands throbbed, but I was alive. The police and fire department didn't show up right away. At first, it was just the two of us standing outside the cafe, staring at the charred counter through the glass door, the acrid smell of burnt plastic and chemicals still heavy in the air. My hands throbbed with pain, and Hayley was trembling so badly she could barely hold her phone as she dialed 911. When the dispatcher asked what had happened, Hayley froze. Her voice cracked as she handed the phone to me, tears streaming down her face. I told them about the explosion, the man who had delivered the package, and the note about Jacob. The words felt surreal coming out of my mouth. My voice shook, and I had to keep pausing to catch my breath. Every time I glanced at Hayley, her pale face and wide, terrified eyes made it harder to stay calm. The fire department arrived first, followed closely by the police. The flashing lights and the distant sound of radios crackling against the quiet night made the reality of what had happened sink in. They ushered us away from the building, checking us over for injuries before starting their investigation. One of the officers pulled us aside to take our statements. When I mentioned the man's insistence on having Hayley open the package, Hayley let out a shaky sob. "It was Jacob," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The officer frowned. "Who's Jacob?" Hayley hesitated, and for a moment I thought she wouldn't answer. Then slowly, she started to talk. She told them everything. How Jacob was her ex-boyfriend, how he'd harassed her after she ended things, and how she'd been too scared to report him. The officer's face hardened as she spoke, his pen scratching across his notepad. "Do you think he's capable of something like this?" he asked. Hayley nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "He told me I'd regret leaving him," she whispered. "But I didn't think he'd go this far." The investigation moved quickly after that. With the description we gave of the delivery driver and the connection to Jacob, the police pieced everything together within days. Jacob had hired someone to deliver the package, intending to kill Hayley. The device inside was crude, homemade, but effective enough to do serious damage if we hadn't gotten out in time. The officer who called to update me on the case told me we were lucky. "Most people don't walk away from something like that with just burns," he said. The cafe closed for repairs, but Hayley didn't stick around to see it reopen. She packed up her things and left town, hoping to start fresh somewhere new. I stayed for a while, trying to convince myself that the worst was behind us. But the truth was, things were never the same. Every time the door swung open, my chest would tighten, and I'd glance at the counter, half expecting another box to be there, waiting for me. Even now, months later, I can't look at delivery packages without feeling a pang of fear. Hayley and I were lucky that night, but the memory of that package, of how close we came to something so much worse, will haunt me forever. I've been a cook at the diner for years. It's not a glamorous job, but I like the rhythm of the late night shifts, the hum of the grill, the occasional chatter of the waitstaff, and the quiet that settles when most of the town is asleep. But that night, the kind of night I'd always thought of as routine, will stay with me forever. We'd hired Jamie a few weeks earlier to handle deliveries. He was just a teenager, full of energy and eager to do well. Jamie had that kind of charm that made him instantly likeable, always cracking jokes and flashing a grin that customers couldn't help but tip. That night, Jamie was scheduled to make a late delivery to a house out by the old logging road. It wasn't unusual. People always seemed to crave burgers and fries at odd hours. But it was the last order of the night. Jamie picked up the bag and, like always, made a joke as he headed out the door. "Don't miss me too much," he said with a wink. I smiled, shaking my head. "Hurry back, I'm not cleaning up for you." I didn't think much of it at first when Jamie didn't return right away. Deliveries could take longer if the customer chatted or dug around for exact change. But as the minutes stretched into an hour, I started to feel uneasy. Jamie was punctual, almost to a fault, and this wasn't like him. I tried calling his phone, but it went straight to voicemail. By the time another half hour had passed, I couldn't sit still anymore. Something wasn't right. I told the waitress to hold down the fort and grabbed my keys. I had the delivery address from the logbook, and I figured I'd find Jamie there, maybe dealing with car trouble or a difficult customer. The drive out to the logging road was unnerving. The streetlights disappeared the further I went, leaving only the glow of my headlights on the gravel road. The trees on either side loomed like dark sentinels, their branches swaying in the cold wind. And then I saw it, Jamie's car, parked on the side of the road. The headlights were off and the driver's door hung open slightly. The bag of food was still on the passenger seat, untouched. My heart sank as I pulled over, parking a few feet away. "Jamie!" I called out, stepping out of my car. My voice echoed into the stillness. Nothing. I shone my flashlight around, the beam cutting through the dark. The air felt heavy, and the only sound was the crunch of gravel beneath my boots. As I approached Jamie's car, I noticed the front tyres. Both were shredded. the rubber torn like someone had slashed them. My stomach twisted. This wasn't an accident. As I moved closer, I heard something. A faint, desperate sound coming from the woods. "Help!" I froze, my breath catching in my throat. The voice was weak, barely audible, over the rustling of the trees, but it was unmistakably human. "Jamie," I called, turning toward the sound. No answer. I swept the flashlight toward the woods, the beam trembling in my hand. "Jamie, where are you?" The voice didn't come again. For a moment I thought I saw movement in the shadows, a figure slipping between the trees. But when I stepped closer, the woods seemed to swallow the light, leaving nothing but darkness. I turned back to Jamie's car, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I noticed something near my own car, a faint glint of metal on the ground. When I crouched down, I saw it. A small spike jammed into the gravel near my front tyre. My chest tightened as I checked the rest of the tyres and found 2 more spikes, deliberately placed to blow out my wheels, just like Jamie's. But my tyres were fine. The spikes had been there, but they hadn't worked. Maybe they hadn't been positioned properly, or maybe the tread on my tyres had been too thick. Either way, I realised just how close I'd come to being stranded. As I straightened up, I heard it again, the crunch of gravel, this time behind me. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping the road, but I saw nothing. Then from the corner of my eye, I caught movement, a figure stepping out from the edge of the woods. He was tall, wearing a dark jacket, his face obscured by a hood. He stood perfectly still, watching me. Before I could react, another sound came from the opposite side of the road. I turned my flashlight just in time to catch a second figure emerging from the trees. My hands shook as I bolted for my car, fumbling with the keys. The figures moved towards me, their footsteps deliberate but calm, as if they knew I had nowhere to go. But I did. The engine roared to life, and I threw the car into reverse, the tyres screeching as I backed up onto the gravel road. My headlights swept across the figures as I sped away, their faces hidden, their bodies disappearing into the shadows. I drove straight back to the diner and called the police. My words spilled out in a frantic rush. Jamie's car, the slashed tyres, the faint voice I'd heard in the woods. The police searched the area, but they didn't find Jamie. They found his car, the shredded tyres, and the spikes near where I'd parked, but nothing else. Days turned into weeks and Jamie never came home. I can't stop thinking about that night. The faint plea for help, the figures in the woods, the spikes meant to trap me too. And Jamie, I'm sorry I couldn't help him. I'm sorry I didn't find him in time. And I'm sorry that I made it out when he didn't. Sometimes, late at night, I hear his voice in my dreams. That faint, desperate whisper, calling out for help that never came. It was a normal Wednesday afternoon, and I was juggling my usual IT tickets when the call came in. "The server in the basement isn't responding," said Erica, our office manager. "Can you check it out?" "Sure," I said, stifling a yawn. It wasn't unusual for equipment in the basement to act up. The space was crammed with old records and outdated tech, hardly a priority for anyone to maintain. I grabbed my toolkit and took the stairs down. The basement wasn't creepy or unusual, just inconvenient. Dim lighting, rows of metal shelves stuffed with office junk, and the occasional whiff of mildew. It was quiet down there, but that's what I liked about it. No interruptions. The server rack was tucked in a corner near the back, humming softly. I knelt down, checked the cables, and spotted the issue right away. A loose connector. Easy fix. As I worked, I was already planning the rest of my afternoon. Then I heard it. The sound of a door closing. I looked up, frowning. I hadn't seen anyone else come down, and there were only 2 ways in, the stairwell and the freight elevator. Both were on the other side of the room. I listened for footsteps, but heard nothing. "Hello?" I called out. My voice carried across the space, but there was no response. I stood, dusting off my hands, and took a cautious step toward the noise. Maybe someone else had come down and didn't realise I was here. I didn't want to scare them, or be scared myself if they popped out suddenly. As I walked between the shelves, I felt a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, the kind you get when you're not alone. I paused at the end of a row, peering into the dimly lit aisle ahead. And then I saw him, a man standing just beyond the next row of shelves. He was tall, wearing a dark hoodie and jeans, with his hands shoved into his pockets. He wasn't looking at me. He seemed to be staring at something on the floor. Can I help you?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. He didn't respond, didn't even flinch. I took a step closer, feeling irritation bubble up alongside my unease. "Hey, this is a private building. You're not supposed to be here." Still nothing. The anger won out. I took another step forward, opening my mouth to repeat myself, but that's when I noticed something. The man wasn't just standing there. He was swaying, almost imperceptibly, like he was trying to keep still but couldn't quite manage it. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice cracking slightly. This time he moved, but not the way I expected. He didn't turn or run. He simply tilted his head up, very slowly, until his face was in full view. I froze. His eyes were glassy and unfocused, his skin pale and slick with sweat. His mouth moved, but no sound came out. For a moment I thought he might be hurt, or sick. Then I saw his hand twitch inside his pocket, and I realised he wasn't alone. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught movement. Another figure stepping out from the shadows at the far end of the room. This one was shorter, stockier, but dressed similarly. They weren't looking at me yet, but they were close. Too close. My stomach dropped as the situation clicked into place. They weren't workers. They weren't lost. They were waiting. I backed up, keeping my eyes on the man in the hoodie. "Look," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "I don't want any trouble. I'll just head upstairs and leave you to whatever this is." The man's mouth twitched into a faint smirk. Then, without warning, he lunged. I stumbled backward, barely managing to dodge him. My back slammed into a shelf, sending a cascade of old file boxes crashing to the floor. The second man started moving toward me, his hands clenched into fists. Panic surged through me. I darted down the nearest aisle, weaving between shelves as fast as I could. The sound of footsteps and crashing boxes followed close behind. I reached the elevator and slammed the button, my fingers trembling. The doors didn't open fast enough. Behind me, I could hear them closing in, their breathing ragged, their footsteps relentless. Finally, the doors slid open, and I threw myself inside. I hit the button for the ground floor and backed against the wall, watching the gap as the doors closed. Just before they shut completely, I saw the taller man step into view. His hoodie had slipped back, revealing a face contorted with rage. The doors sealed, and the elevator began to rise. I sagged against the wall, my chest heaving. When the elevator finally opened on the ground floor, I stumbled out, gasping for air. The security desk was a few feet away, but the guard wasn't sitting in his usual spot. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky. I rounded the corner and found him slumped in his chair, unconscious. His keys were missing, and a dark bruise had started to form on the side of his face. I grabbed my phone and called the police. It took hours to piece together what had happened. The police discovered that the men had broken into the basement with a clear objective: accessing the company's servers. Someone had paid them to steal confidential data, financial records, client lists, trade secrets. It was corporate espionage, and I had stumbled right into the middle of it. They had likely meant to silence me before I could raise the alarm, giving them time to finish their job. The guard had been their first victim, knocked out and dragged into a corner where no one would see him from the lobby. The intruders had fled when I got away, but the police found evidence of their tampering. A USB drive was left plugged into the server, filled with downloaded files. The thought haunts me, how close I came to being a loose end they needed to tie up. Now every time I walk into the office, I can't help but glance toward the basement door, wondering if they'll ever come back to finish what they started. I'll never forget the call from Marcus. His name flashed on my phone screen, and I answered with my usual, "What's up, Doc?" He hated that joke, but this time there was no laughter, no sarcasm in his reply. "James," he said, his voice low and strained. "It's bad, really bad. Marcus and I had been best friends since med school. He was the guy everyone looked up to, the one who stayed late to check on patients, the one who made the impossible look routine. He was a surgeon with a kind of focus and precision that could put anyone at ease. But that day, he sounded like he was carrying the weight of the world. We met at a diner near the hospital. He looked like hell. Bloodshot eyes, rumpled scrubs, hands trembling as he stirred his coffee. "It wasn't my fault," he said, staring at the table. "But they're going to blame me." I leaned forward. "What happened?" He took a shaky breath. "Routine gallbladder surgery. Young woman, healthy, perfect candidate. Everything was going fine until she crashed." "What do you mean, crashed?" "Logan overdosed her," Marcus said, his voice bitter. Too much propofol. He was off his game, slurring his words when we started. I knew something was wrong, but by the time I realised how bad it was, her heart had stopped. We tried to bring her back, but she was gone. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I'd met Logan before, the anaesthesiologist who always smelled faintly of whiskey. Marcus had warned me about him months ago, complaining that he'd reported Logan's drinking to their supervisor multiple times. "They didn't do anything," Marcus continued, his voice cracking. "Budget cuts, staff shortages, all the usual excuses, and now I'm the one under investigation. The hospital's throwing me under the bus to cover their ass." The patient's husband filed a malpractice suit a week later. Marcus's name was plastered across headlines, and his reputation, built on years of dedication and skill, was torn apart overnight. Patients cancelled their appointments, colleagues avoided him, and the hospital issued a statement calling it a tragic but preventable error. Logan meanwhile resigned quietly. No investigation, no accountability. "I can't believe he's walking free," Marcus told me one night over drinks. "I warned them. I begged them to pull him. But now it's my name on the death certificate." I didn't know what to say. Marcus was right. He'd done everything he could, but the system had failed him, just like it had failed that patient. 6 months after the lawsuit was settled, I was on shift in the ER when the call came through. Gunshots fired in the surgical wing. My heart stopped. Marcus had just gone back into the OR that week, his first surgery since the incident. I dropped everything and ran. The scene was chaos. Nurses were huddled behind desks, a security guard was bleeding on the floor, and standing outside the OR was the patient's husband, a gun in his hand. "You killed her!" he screamed, his voice raw with grief. Marcus stood frozen in the OR doorway, his scrubs splattered with someone else's blood. Not his, not yet. "It wasn't his fault," I said, stepping forward cautiously. "Marcus didn't kill her." The husband turned to me, his face twisted with rage and tears. "He was there. He let it happen. He didn't stop it." Marcus spoke, his voice steady, despite the fear in his eyes. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. If I could take it back, I would, but killing me won't bring her back." For a moment, the husband wavered. Then, with a heartbreaking cry, he raised the gun and fired. Marcus fell, clutching his chest as blood soaked his scrubs. The husband dropped the gun and collapsed to his knees, sobbing uncontrollably. Marcus was gone before they could get him to the OR. The funeral was quiet, sombre. I sat in the back, seething with anger. Marcus had been destroyed by a system that protected the wrong people. And Logan had walked away without so much as a slap on the wrist. I couldn't let it go. 2 nights after the funeral, I drove to Logan's house. His porch light was on, his car parked neatly in the driveway. I knocked on the door, and when he answered, his face went pale. "James," he stammered, "what are you—" I didn't let him finish. I grabbed him by the collar and slammed him into the wall, my fist connecting with his jaw. He tried to fight back, but months of pent-up rage fueled every punch I threw. His wife screamed from the living room, begging me to stop, but I didn't care. "This is for Marcus," I shouted, my voice shaking with fury. "This is for that woman, for her husband, for everyone you destroyed." By the time I stepped back, Logan was crumpled on the floor, bleeding and gasping for air. His wife sobbed as she cradled him, but I didn't feel an ounce of remorse. I walked out, knowing full well what would come next. The hospital suspended me the next day. They said my actions were unbecoming of a medical professional. And they were right. I didn't fight it. I left medicine altogether, promising myself I'd never go back. Now every time I think about Marcus, about the look in his eyes when he told me it wasn't his fault, I know I'd make the same choice again. This is the story I tell everyone who asks me why I left that perfect job as an auditor for one of the big 4 companies and went back to my parents' farm. On paper, it had everything: a prestigious name, a fast-track career path, and enough money to make my student loans disappear in a few years. But no one warns you about what comes with all that, not until it's too late. I was fresh out of college when I landed the job. Bright-eyed, eager to prove myself, I threw everything I had into it. The hours were brutal, 12, 14, sometimes 16-hour days, but I told myself it was worth it. After all, I was learning from the best, working alongside some of the smartest people I'd ever met. One of those people was Sophie. Sophie was everything I aspired to be. She was in her late 20s, sharp as a blade, with a knack for numbers that left everyone in awe. She had this way of making people laugh during even the most grueling audits, her quick wit cutting through the tension in the room. But there were cracks in her armour. I noticed them about 3 months into the job, when Sophie started coming in later and later, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. At first I thought she was just pulling extra hours like the rest of us. But then the signs started piling up. She stopped joining us for coffee breaks. Her jokes grew more forced, and her hands trembled when she typed. One morning during a meeting, Sophie collapsed. She'd been presenting a report when her words slurred. Her face went pale, and she dropped to the floor. Everyone froze, unsure of what to do. It was our manager, Greg, who finally called for help, his voice more annoyed than concerned. When the paramedics arrived, they said Sophie's collapse was due to exhaustion and dehydration. They took her to the hospital, and for a moment I thought this might be the wake-up call we all needed, that maybe the company would start valuing our health over deadlines. But Sophie was back 2 days later. Her smile was as brittle as glass when she walked into the office, clutching a thermos of coffee. "Just a little scare," she said, waving off our questions. But I saw the look in her eyes, the hollow, haunted look of someone who was barely holding it together. Greg didn't even acknowledge her absence. He just handed her another stack of files and said, "We're behind. I need you to catch up." Things only got worse from there. Sophie started staying even later, often working through the night. Once I came in early to find her sitting at her desk, the same clothes from the day before hanging off her like they'd absorbed her exhaustion. "Are you okay?" I asked quietly. She didn't look up. "I'm fine," she mumbled, her voice flat. "Just need to finish this report." I wanted to push, to tell her she didn't have to do this, but I didn't. I was new. I didn't want to rock the boat. I wish I had. It happened on a Friday. The office was buzzing with its usual chaos. Phones ringing, keyboards clacking, the hum of voices discussing budgets and deadlines. I was at my desk when I heard a scream. It was high-pitched, raw, and it came from the direction of Sophie's office. We all turned at once, a collective sense of dread settling over the room. I was the first to reach her door. It was open, and the sight inside stopped me cold. Sophie was standing by the window, her hands pressed against the glass, staring down at the street below. Her desk was a mess, papers scattered, her laptop knocked to the floor. "Sophie," I said, stepping closer. She turned to me then, her eyes filled with tears. "I can't do this anymore, Brian," she whispered. "I'm so tired." Before I could respond, before I could even think, she climbed onto the ledge. I rushed forward, reaching out, but I wasn't fast enough. She jumped. The rest of the day is a blur in my memory. The screams, the sirens, the horrified faces of my co-workers as we stood at the window, staring down at the motionless figure on the pavement below. The company sent us all home that day, claiming they'd provide counselling, but no one really talked about what happened. By Monday, it was as if Sophie had never existed. Her desk was cleared, her name erased from our email lists. Greg told us to focus on our work, to honour her memory by pushing through. I lasted another 2 weeks. Then one night I packed up my things, handed in my resignation, and drove back to my parents' farm. People ask me all the time if I regret leaving. They don't understand how I could walk away from a career like that. But they didn't see what I saw. They didn't see Sophie. Now when I wake up, I see the sunrise over open fields instead of spreadsheets. I breathe fresh air instead of stale office AC. And when I think about Sophie, I remind myself that no job, no matter how prestigious, is worth a life. Not hers, not mine, not anyone's. I'm not going to tell you the name of the school where this happened. Not because I'm afraid of the school itself, no, that chapter of my life is long closed, but because there are people tied to that place who I wouldn't dare provoke. For my own safety, I'll just call it the Academy. When I got the job, I thought I'd won the lottery, teaching at a private high school where parents paid 6 figures for their kids to attend. It seemed like a dream come true. The campus looked like something out of a college brochure. Manicured lawns, ivy-covered buildings, state-of-the-art everything. My classroom had windows that overlooked a courtyard fountain, and my students, for the most part, were polite and well-dressed. At first, everything was perfect. The pay was great, the facilities were incredible, and the students seemed eager to learn. But there was an undercurrent of something else, something I didn't fully grasp until it was too late. The Academy wasn't just a school. It was a place where the ultra-wealthy sent their kids to glide through life unscathed. Rules didn't apply to them the way they did to the rest of us. And when someone pushed back against that reality, the results could be devastating. I didn't know any of that when I started. Not yet, but then he arrived. His name was Brandon Whitmore, and from the moment he walked into my class, I knew he was trouble. Not in the loud, obvious way. No, his trouble was quieter, more insidious. He strolled in late, sunglasses perched on his head, tossing his bag onto a desk, without so much as a glance in my direction. I'd heard whispers about Brandon in the teacher's lounge. He'd been expelled from multiple schools before landing at the Academy, each time for increasingly concerning behaviour. But I wanted to give him a chance, to believe that maybe here things would be different. They weren't. Brandon was disruptive, mocking his classmates, rolling his eyes during lessons. He rarely handed in assignments, and when I confronted him, he'd flash a smirk and say, "My dad will take care of it." The breaking point came during a group project. Brandon lost his temper when one of his teammates suggested a different idea. Without warning, he grabbed a chair and hurled it across the room. The chair hit Jacob, a quiet, bookish student who never caused trouble. Jacob screamed as he crumpled to the floor, clutching his arm. I froze for a moment, shocked, before rushing to Jacob's side. His arm was broken. After getting Jacob to the nurse, I marched straight to the principal's office. "Brandon needs to be suspended," I said, still shaking from what had happened. "This isn't just a disciplinary issue, it's a safety concern." The principal gave me a tired look, one I would come to recognise as defeat. "I'll talk to his father," he said. That was the beginning of my nightmare. The next morning, Brandon's father showed up. I'd heard about him, an influential businessman with deep pockets and a reputation for getting what he wanted. He strode into my classroom after the final bell, his tailored suit and expensive watch gleaming under the fluorescent lights. "Ms. Carter," he said, smiling in a way that made my skin crawl. "I understand you've had some concerns about my son." I explained what had happened, trying to stay calm, but his smile vanished the moment I mentioned suspension. "That's not going to happen," he said flatly. "Brandon's staying in school, and I suggest you drop this little crusade of yours." I bristled. "This isn't personal, Mr. Whitmore. Your son's behaviour was dangerous, and there need to be consequences." His face darkened. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." The conversation ended with a thinly veiled threat. "I'd hate for this to affect your career, Ms. Carter, or your personal life." I reported the encounter to the principal, but he just sighed and said, "Let's tread carefully. Mr. Whitmore is important to the school." Brandon returned to class the next day, smirking like he'd won. The threats didn't stop there. Anonymous emails began showing up in my inbox, warning me to back off. One evening I came out to the parking lot and found my car tyres slashed. But the worst came one night when I arrived home to find my front door ajar. At first, I thought I'd forgotten to lock it, but when I stepped inside, my stomach dropped. Drawers were pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. And then I noticed the empty dog bed in the corner. Max, my golden retriever, was gone. Panic set in as I searched the house, calling his name. That's when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was a picture of Max tied up and trembling. "Drop the suspension, or he doesn't come home." I called the police, but they dismissed it as a prank. The school, they didn't even pretend to care. "It's best if we let this go," the principal said. his voice weary. The next morning I resigned. Max was returned to me a few days later, left in my backyard in the dead of night. He was unharmed but traumatised, and so was I. Years passed and I tried to move on. I started teaching at a small public school, far away from the world of privilege and power. I didn't think about Brandon or the Whitmores anymore, until the day I saw the headline. Heir to Whitmore fortune arrested for fatal DUI crash. Brandon had been driving drunk when he ploughed into a minivan. The accident killed a family of 4, including 2 young children. I stared at the screen, my hands trembling. I wasn't shocked, not really. This was the inevitable outcome of a life without accountability. What infuriated me was the thought of all the chances people had to stop him, to teach him consequences, and how they'd chosen to look the other way. The academy, his father, the system, they'd all protected him, enabling his behaviour until it cost innocent lives. I saw what people are willing to sacrifice to protect the powerful, even if it means destroying innocent lives. And that was something I couldn't live with. Thank you for joining me today as we delved into these chilling tales of workplace horror. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up, share it with someone who loves a good scare, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more spine-tingling stories. Have you experienced your own real-life horror? I'd love to hear about it. Send your real-life terrifying tales to the email in the description below. Who knows? Your story might just be featured in an upcoming video. Until next time, stay vigilant and keep an eye on your surroundings. In the workplace, the true horrors often brew in the most unsuspecting corners, like a sinister potion waiting to take hold.